Welcome. We are back for a fiery tale indeed. It would seem Jacob is back for a little payback, and we have all the sordid details. So if you haven't already, please like, share, and subscribe for more tales of the supernatural and unknown.
I can still hear the echoes of that unholy night in the dense forest. Those red eyes, guttural roars, and the stench of burnt wood mingling with blood stirring in my nostrils. It's been months since that fateful encounter at the cabin. I'm Timothy, and I never imagined that I'd set foot back into that forest, back into that nightmare. But when Jacob, his eyes ablaze with grief and rage, declared that he was going to make those things in the forest, those monsters pay for killing Antonio, I knew I had to follow him. Not because I believed in blind vengeance, but because I hoped to make some sense of what happened that night and find out what those things were. Jacob had become a shadow of his former self. The merciless death of Antonio weighed heavily on his heart, and him nearly meeting his end as well had twisted his grief into a burning desire for retribution. I remember the day he first told me about his plan. We sat in my garage with a half-empty bottle of whiskey between us as he detailed his months of training. His voice was low, deliberate, and every word dripped with a promise of blood. He sounded like some old, grizzled veteran.
I've been training with some guys I met, Timothy. I met them through an online group. Every day I get a little better with the flamethrower, with the shotgun. I've even picked up a few tricks with Molotovs,
he said, eyes fixed as he were staring into a distant future.
I'm gonna hunt them down. I'm gonna make them pay for what they did to us, to Antonio.
I wanted to tell him what I had discovered, to warn him that the forest wasn't simply a battleground for his grief, but it was a living, breathing entity steeped in history, a history that stretched back to long before us. I had learned of an event that had scarred these woods in ways we could barely imagine. But his thirst for vengeance was an immovable force. So, I agreed to join him. Jacob told me that he had already contacted Lindsay and Mira. Lindsay refused to answer any of his calls or messages, and Mira was now living in Australia and wanted nothing to do with his vendetta. Who could blame them? Over the next few months, with the help of David Welks and Jasper Lawson, two of the men Jacob met in an online group about cryptids, we assembled our arsenal, a motley collection of flamethrowers, tactical shotguns loaded with coveted Dragon's Breath rounds, and dozens of Molotov cocktails. Our small group consisted of Jacob, consumed by grief, David and Jasper, who had their own grudges, and myself. David and Jasper's experience was somewhat like ours. They too had lost friends and loved ones to these creatures. Once everything was ready, we had a few more meetings to make sure we would all be on the same page and knew what to do and where to go given certain contingencies. Finally, the day had come. As planned, we met up at Jacob's parents' cabin. It was a few hours before dusk, so we steeled ourselves for what was to come. We all knew the plan. The forest looked just as it had been during that first nightmarish night, dense underbrush and the towering trees that obscured the sky. But there was something different about the cabin.
Ah, you notice, huh?
Jacob shouted from the porch as I arrived.
I made some changes, added some floodlights on the perimeter that have motion sensors. I also reinforced the doors and added Cat 5 impact windows,
he said with this devilish grin on his face. As we geared up, Jacob began to explain to me all he had learned. He explained that David and Jasper had come across what they think was their nest during one of their treks through the woods. It was during this that they lost 2 people to those damn creatures. He told me they were called tree spirits, but he wasn't telling me anything I didn't already know. I knew that much from doing my own research and asking people that lived around these forests. Anyway, the plan was to burn that damn place down to the ground. There was an uneasy pause that seemed to linger longer than it was. Jacob shouted angrily,
I don't care. Those things are going to pay. I can't stop seeing Antonio's face. And I can't believe you don't feel the same. Those things would have killed all of us that night, and here you are feeling sorry for them.
The words flowed from his mouth like hot lava. I didn't respond. I suppose he was right. Although I couldn't see what happened to me. The 3 slashes on my back I received that night were very real. With dusk fast approaching, each of us filed out the front door of the cabin and loaded up our ATVs with ammunition, flamethrowers, and our weapon of choice. Even as we mounted our ATVs and headed down a trail, I couldn't shake this pervasive feeling of being watched from the shadows. We rode along this trail with Jacob in the lead ATV, down the paths that had once led us to the cabin, but now they felt foreign, charged with malevolent energy. As we rode, my mind raced with thoughts of the information I'd gathered from murmured local legends. The locals said that a raging fire had swept through these woods decades ago, a fire that not only scorched the land, but awakened something ancient. No one knew what started the fire, but they all agreed that these creatures didn't appear until afterwards. That's when the missing hikers and hunters started to be reported. I believed them. Jacob, however, was focused solely on retribution. He barked orders as we maneuvered through tangled brush, his determination turning each step into a promise of violence. It was not long before I began to hear that familiar sound. I heard that day of our encounter. It was as if the trees had been awakened. "There!" he shouted, pointing ahead where the trees began to part. In the distance, a pair of glowing red eyes peered from the darkness. My heart pounded as the creatures revealed themselves, a grotesque fusion of twisted wood and sinewy muscle, their limbs elongated with sharp claws at the end, moving with an unsettling grace as they flanked us. With that, a flaming Molotov flew over my head into 2 of the creatures. The flash of light as the liquid inside was set ablaze sent a clear message to these creatures as they turned and ran. We weren't the hunted, but the hunters this night. We all encircled our ATVs and dismounted. Jacob didn't hesitate to press the advantage. With a ferocity I'd never seen, he unleashed a torrent of flames from his flamethrower, the searing heat illuminating the creatures' horrifying features as they shrieked in agony. I fired my shotgun, spitting dragon's breath rounds into them as they approached. For a moment, the forest was bathed in a terrible light, a dance of fire and shadows. But the tree spirits were not so easily vanquished. They swarmed from the depths of the forest, appearing as if the trees themselves had come to life, their limbs twisting and contorting as they advanced. In the chaos, I found myself torn between instinct and reason. I tried to call out to Jacob, to urge him to slow down, to consider that these beings might be more than mere monsters. "Jacob, listen, there's history here. These spirits, they're guardians. They're not our enemies unless we force their hand," I shouted as the battle raged on around us. His response was a snarl, his eyes as wild as the fire raging around us.
Guardians. They murdered my friend, our colleague. I'm not gonna listen to your fairy tales while they haunt these woods.
And with that, he charged forward again, a man possessed by rage. Our initial skirmish was pretty one-sided. With the embers of fire and smoke in the air, we mounted our ATVs and pushed deeper into the forest. The air grew thick with the acrid smell of burning wood and the metallic tang of blood. We all had minor scrapes on our bodies. Even so, I couldn't shake the images of our previous encounter, the horror of Antonio's last moments, the sickening sound of Jacob's fall, the desperate scramble to barricade the cabin. Now, the forest itself seemed to retaliate, as if echoing the agony of those lost souls. As we forged ahead, we reached a clearing near the remnants of an old logging road. Here, the battle intensified. Molotov cocktails arced through the air, bursting into flames as they hit clusters of tree spirits. I found myself back to back with David, our eyes fixed on the relentless advance of these creatures. The air was filled with shouts, the roar of fire from our flamethrowers, and the unyielding crackle of fire. Amid this maelstrom, I couldn't help but notice strange symbols scorched into the bark of the trees, cryptic marks that hinted at an older, almost sacred history that our brute force would never comprehend. Jacob was unstoppable, a whirlwind of violence as he fired his tactical shotgun, each shot an act of defiance against these monsters that had wronged him. I fought beside him, my own hesitations drowned out by the roar of combat. Yet even as I exchanged fire with these otherworldly beings, my mind churned with questions. Every burst of flame, every cry of defiance from Jacob seemed to push the forest further into a state of wrath. I feared that, in our quest for revenge, we were only fueling a primordial anger that had lain dormant for decades. As the battle raged, one of the creatures slashed me across my chest. Even though it was just a slash, it sent me flying, barreling into Jasper, knocking both of us to the ground. I thought for sure we were done for, but David quickly came to our aid, tossing his cocks, sending shots into tree spirits as they attempted to advance on us. As I looked at Jasper, I could see blood dripping from his mouth. He just wiped it away with his forearm and he loaded his shotgun. And as he took aim, he was like a man possessed, firing shot after blazing shot, shouting into the night.
Oh-wee! Burn, you motherfuckers, burn!
Finally, we made our way to a place where the trees grew so thick and ancient that you couldn't even see the night sky. It was there, among the gnarled roots and whispering leaves, that Jacob made his final move. With a grim determination, he signaled for us to set up a makeshift perimeter. We knew that the only way to end this was to strike at the very heart of these beings. Jacob rigged a series of incendiary devices, clusters of Molotov cocktails, and placed them strategically around this mound that was situated at the edge of the clearing. As we ran back to our vehicles, Jacob triggered the devices. The clearing erupted in a torrent of flames. The inferno roared to life, consuming everything in its path. Tree spirits, their forms shifting between fury and agony, shrieked as they were engulfed in the blaze. I watched as everything around us became engulfed in flames. Jacob just stood there with this look on his face, trapped between joy and insanity. I had to grab him lest we be caught up in the flames as well. As we rode off through the forest from whence we came, it was plain to see that the fire had raged out of control. Like a living beast awakened, it spread relentlessly through the forest, leaping from tree to tree. I stood at the edge of the conflagration, watching in horror as the flames danced through the darkness, consuming the land. Jacob, his face illuminated by a hellish glow, roared in triumph.
This is for our friends,
He shouted, his voice cracking with raw emotion. The fire raged on, devouring everything in its path, leaving behind only charred remains and an eerie silence. It was done. We had prevailed, but at what cost? We all made it back to the cabin, but would there even be a cabin when it was all said and done? We only had time to jump into our vehicles and speed away through the smoke-filled night. Days later, the news was filled with reports of a massive forest fire. No one knew how it started. This all sounded so familiar to me. The authorities talked about possible motives or what could have caused the fire, but nothing came close to the truth of that night. I watched the news in disbelief, haunted by images of flames and the twisted silhouettes of trees against a blood-red sky. The forest we had once known was gone, replaced by a barren wasteland that seemed to pulse with an eerie, lingering presence. In this, our confrontation with the tree spirits, it wasn't just our friends we lost, but it was the hope of ever setting things right. The land is scarred, a constant reminder of our hubris. I can still see the charred stumps where once towering trees stood, and sometimes, in the quiet twilight, I swear I see flickers of red eyes watching from the ruins, a silent promise that the forest's guardians, angered by the flames of our revenge, are not truly gone. I have my research notes, the whispered legends from locals, and the haunting images of symbols carved into surviving trees, hinting at a history we'll never fully grasp. I had hoped to convince Jacob of the truth, that these beings were protectors, wronged long before we ever set foot in their territory. But in the end, I was just an unwilling passenger on a collision course with fate. Years later, in the aftermath, as the authorities scrambled to understand the inexplicable rise in missing persons in the area, one truth remains clear. Revenge, no matter how justified it seems, can awaken forces that we are powerless to control. And somewhere out there, in the charred remains of what was once a thriving woodland, the tree spirits continue their eternal vigil, waiting, perhaps, for the next trespasser to disturb their sanctuary. As I pen down these events, I can't help but wonder if our story is just one thread in a tapestry of mysteries, one of many ways people vanish into the depths of the forest. The flames have long since died down, but the embers of our vengeance and the spirit's wrath may burn on, unseen, waiting for the next unfortunate souls.
Well, Jacob and his squad went all scorched earth. Sometimes revenge can bring nothing more than more sleepless nights. I hope that you liked our tale. As always, please like, share, and subscribe. And should you find yourself lost along your journey, let the light be your guide.